Howdy and hello everyone, and welcome to a video I've been pondering on for over a year now, and after a certain someone brought it up and into the spotlight, I think now is a good time to finally bring up what a privatization of Amtrak would look like, but also how it could finally put Amtrak into a place of success that would allow the government and users of the system to finally see rail as a suitable alternative to driving. Now, before I start on this video, I must point out now, before people start yelling in the comments, I do not expect any of what I'm discussing here to happen anytime soon. I'm simply providing a look into what could be done to make Amtrak a service people will want to frequently use and not have to dwell on how driving or flying is cheaper and easier. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. Part 1. An overseas example. The privatization of Amtrak would not be easy and would not be simple. If we took the system as it is now and threw it into being a big private company with no preparation, it would fail within weeks. So, the privatization of Amtrak has to be done with some strategy. And thankfully, a certain overseas country successfully managed to privatize the majority of their rail network and make it work extremely well. I'm of course referring to Japan and their national network. Japan's rail system was in a very similar situation to Amtrak, in some ways worse and in some ways better. In the late 20th century, Japan's National Railway Organization was in trillions of yen in debt, with ridership plummeting. So, the Japanese government decided to privatize it with the goal of companies to eventually appear on the stock exchange. The national rail system was split into 9 companies, all managing a separate region of the country, with them sharing and leasing the national Shinkansen system. Going over the whole structure of the Japanese rail system would take ages, and thankfully this wonderful video by Wendover Productions went over it in full detail. But, to sum it up, the Japanese rail system works as private entities because the government was willing to invest in the initial private companies, allowing them to improve their services, leading to higher ridership, which led to more profits, leading to even more improvements, leading to a cycle of ridership and improvements that has led to Japan being a golden jewel of rail transportation in the modern day. But now the question arises, how do we apply this to Amtrak? Part 2. The game plan. In comparison to Japan's initial national rail network, Amtrak is better off ridership-wise, with them recently showing record-high ridership numbers, leading to Amtrak nearing a profit. However, in most other ways, Amtrak is the same, if not worse. Despite the fact that rail doesn't actually need to be profitable, only provide a service, Amtrak's inability to make a profit over its almost 55 years of service is one of the main gripes government officials have to say about it. Amtrak's horrible equipment and capacity issues are also a major problem. Their lack of owned or at least priority on right-of-ways is also a major reoccurring issue. And the two main issues being cost and travel times are ever present, with Amtrak often taking longer than driving, with it being far more expensive. If Amtrak were to split into private companies similar to Japan's JR system, these problems could be easily fixed with incentives. So, let's look over the 2 plans I've come up with for a privatized Amtrak system. All plans start the same. The Amtrak system is split into 7 sections and 1 for-sure company, based on region and services. All regions must have at least 1 corridor service and staff 1 long-distance service. I'll get into the long-distance stuff later because it requires its own special description of operations. The regions would be dubbed as the following: Amtrak California, Amtrak Cascades, Amtrak Deseret, Amtrak West, Amtrak Midwest, Amtrak South, and Amtrak Northeast. Now this is where the 2 plans split off. This plan would be the government would source existing Amtrak executives to be the CEOs and other major roles of these companies, and all Amtrak staff in the area would be assigned to whatever Amtrak company they fall under. If you're familiar with Amtrak naming, you probably recognize 3 of these names: Amtrak California, Amtrak Cascades, and Amtrak Midwest. The names for 3 state-supported Amtrak services that include many of Amtrak's most major corridor routes. These sections could easily go under full control of the state, But because, as we have seen with a certain someone, states aren't much better than the federal government when it comes to improving or even just prioritizing rail over car infrastructure. So let's just say these would be private entities along with everything else. These companies would all be kickstarted by federal grants that would allow these services to quickly and effectively make improvements. Grants would be gauged by how much money would be needed to kickstart a profitable cycle. Basically, the Northeast services would get the least, as those services are already very profitable as it is. Amtrak West, Desert, and South would get the most, because most of them are the classic runs twice per day on freight-owned trackage Amtrak standard that has led to this mess in the first place, with a good few of them not even having corridor routes at the time of me making this video, only long-distance services. You'll also probably notice that Florida is excluded from all of this. This is because Brightline is basically Florida's rail daddy, so all Amtrak operations in this area would be given to Brightline, with also some funding to allow them to expand service all throughout the Florida region to validate Amtrak handing over this service. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the infamous long-distance services. The long-distance services would all go under one company, being Amtrak Long Distance. Amtrak Long Distance would have the purpose of providing equipment, schedules, and maintenance, along with routing for all long-distance services, with the other 7 companies providing basically everything else. The reason why we aren't just getting rid of the long-distance services because all are unprofitable, with all but one being horribly unprofitable, is 1, because long-distance services are in many cases the only car alternative for many small towns along their route, and 2, because there is literally a US law stating that these services cannot be abolished because of that, so we have to do something about them. This company would be kind of similar to how Amtrak is now, but would be more on the private side. Basically, the government would provide funding to keep the service operating, with hopes that over time, and with the help of the other 7 companies, the service would start to need less and less help from the government as service gets more and more efficient. Here's an example of how these long-distance services would operate. We'll use the Coast Starlight, which runs from Los Angeles to Seattle, for the example. Amtrak Long Distance would provide equipment, collect all tickets, and perform maintenance at Los Angeles, Oakland, Portland, and Seattle for all long-distance equipment. Amtrak California would provide staff for all Californian crew bases, and all south from Klamath Falls. And Amtrak Cascades would provide all staff for everything north of Klamath Falls. Basically, the operating cost is distributed among all companies involved to lessen the blow on the long-distance company. Now, before we move into the second option, you're probably thinking, well, profitability would still be hard for all of these companies and routes because passenger rail is already extremely hard to make profitable. Well, my fellow viewer, this is where we talk about the main way besides tickets passenger rail companies can make money. That being real estate. Moving back over to Japan, the JR companies I mentioned highly dabble in real estate to drive up profitability, with many owning full-on resorts that are directly next to their stations, allowing them to not only collect the money from the train tickets to the resort, but also the money spent on rooms, leisure in the resort, and any other resort-owned ways to make a profit. There's even an example of this in the US with Brightline. Brightline owns, or at least takes from, the profits of a lot of businesses and housing in or around their stations to help drive up profits beyond ticket prices. This also has the bonus of giving passengers the ability to live, work, or just spend the day around the station, removing the need to use the bus, call an Uber, or anything else along those lines, because everything is within walking distance of the station. The new Amtrak companies could easily apply all of this to their own network. Many stations that kind of drop passengers off in the middle of nowhere could easily be developed into a little mini town, which the companies will draw profits from, improving the experience of the passenger and upping the profits of the company. I could probably go more into railroads and real estate, but let's move on to option 2. Option 2 would start the same as 1. The Amtrak system is split into regions with a long-distance company. However, where it splits off is these regions are less vast areas with routes in them, and rather, routes are put up for sale, and a private company will go in and take up the service. With money from the government, said company can rapidly improve said service. Going back to California, let's look at the 3 corridor routes there: Surfliner, San Joaquin's, and the Capital Corridor. will exclude San Joaquin since the state has plans to take up that and own it themselves. These two routes could easily be put up for sale, quote unquote, and a private company would come in and acquire them. Surfliner would be especially enticing as it has Amtrak's highest ridership outside of the Northeast, so with a few improvements, it could easily become a profit powerhouse given with how many people travel between all the destinations along its route. And because the Capital Corridor and Surfliner run along the route of the Coast Starlight, this said company would take up the roles needed for the Coast Starlight's California portion. Said company would have the option of only buying Surfliner or only buying Capital Corridor, and if they were to do this, they would only take up the long distance rules for whatever portion they acquired. While routes are waiting to be taken up, Amtrak will continue to operate said routes until a company comes along to acquire it. That way, there isn't a sudden pause in nationwide services. So, either way with these two plans, if all goes well, Amtrak will be privatized with the goal to make transit efficient and profitable. Part 3. Operations a decade in. Once operations are fully up and running, and hopefully running well, I'd imagine rail in the US would not only begin to see more riders but also just more general enthusiasm from the public and the government for any future rail projects now that it's been proven rail can work in the US. Rail funding would seem less like an uphill battle fighting with politicians and more like how funding for roadways work today, which barely anyone notices it's even happening. All they see is improvements appear as they continue to use the system. This would mostly be seen in high-speed rail and smaller rapid transit and commuter rail operations. High-speed rail projects could be funded 10 times easier, and considering how more people will have experience working with rail at this time, they would get done quicker and for a cheaper cost. For regional/commuter rail and smaller rapid transit LRV systems, things like new lines, routing changes in favor of connectivity and speed, and general improvements would be a breeze to accomplish with new trust gained in rail. And for the second option, since I doubt one whole company would take up the whole or half the system, there could even be signs of competition, which is a joy for seeing improvements and better service as companies try to attract more riders with more favorable options. In general, the privatization of Amtrak could easily start a true rail renaissance in the US of rapid improvements and the possibility of the US finally having a true alternative to flying or driving. And I feel where we are right now is why we aren't seeing this renaissance in its full form now. Yes, there are some great projects in the works, but for as long as the most widespread form of rail continues to be costly, slow, and inefficient, there will truly be no way to keep the public from not trusting future rail projects, and from keeping the government from wanting to make rail better. That's partly why at the start of this video I said how I don't believe this plan will happen anytime soon. This would only happen if the government sees rail as a good thing to invest in, and as it stands now, they don't seem to think that in the slightest. So, in conclusion, if we want rail in the US to truly improve, privatization or not, all we need is for the public and the government to have a shared willingness to invest heavily in rail with the prospect of future improvements, allowing for a spiral of success for generations to come. So, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video essay on the privatization of Amtrak. As I mentioned, this is something I've been wanting to talk about for ages, and I'm finally able to show you all my ideas on how it could work. And I encourage you to put your own ideas in the comments on privatization or just how you think Amtrak and rail in the US can be truly put on the right track. So, without much left to say, I was 5008 Creations, you were the viewer, and I'll see you in the future. Goodbye.